Hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Please, the facilitator should go. Mr. Awa Omaka, share your screen and start the session, please. Good morning, Mr. Awa. Can you hear me, please?
Good morning. Can hear you.
Okay, my name is Ridwan. I work with ICAN Online Tutors. Please, we have some participants already waiting, and there's no need for us to delay any further. You can share your screen and start the session, please. Mr. Awa, can you confirm you had everything I said? Rachel, please confirm if you're on this call, please.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah,
Mr. Awa is here.
yeah, I think maybe you should try and reach out to him because I don't think he's getting the information I just said. I'm not sure he got the information.
We'll be starting shortly.
Good morning, everyone. Please confirm you can hear me so that we can get started.
Good morning. Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Thank you very much. My name is Awa Omaka, and I will be your facilitator for this session. A brief introduction. I've been in the IT audit space for over 15 years, and up until March 7th, I was the head of IT audit at Ikeja Electric before I transitioned to the health sector, also on the same role as well. So in terms of IT audit, I think you're in good company. But today is really not about me. The goal, which should also be yours, is to help build your confidence so that you're to write and pass the CISA exams. Today we'll be looking at domain 5, which is protection of information assets. So if you will, I'd like to share my screen so that we could get started. Please confirm you can see my screen.
Yes,
Yes,
we can
it's
see the
visible.
screen.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. So house rules. If you have questions, please by show of hands, you can let me know, indicate that you have a question, or you can also drop that in the chat box. I'll take my time and answer as best as I can as well. In between this session, we'll have a few minutes for stretch break because health is actually very important. So like I reiterated earlier, we're looking at protection of information assets, and the subtopic is introduction to logical access controls. Now, before I start, it's important I let you know that there are 5 domains to the CISA exams. The first domain is information systems auditing process, which has a weight of about 18%. Domain 2 is governance and management of IT. Domain 3 is information systems acquisition, development, and implementation, which basically speaks to SDLC. Domain 4 is information systems operations and business resilience, while domain 5, which is what we're looking at today, is protection of information. Now, I just wanted to point out that domain 4 and 5 carry a weight of 26% each, which is basically like 52%, which is more than half the weight of the entire exams. And one of the things I love about protection of information asset is the fact that it is very practical. It covers security framework, network security, and data protection. Okay. Now, please confirm you can still see my screen. What you see here is called the learning objectives. At the end of the day, this is what I hope we can all learn. One is the logical access control concepts and objectives. And even as we delve into these sub topics, I hope to use practical scenarios to help reinforce some of this concept so that it helps you understand the access control concepts. We'll be looking at access authentication, authorization, and accountability mechanisms. We'll also look at the life cycle of these controls. We'll look at audit procedures for logical access reviews. And then we'll briefly look at some of the Cisa style exam questions that might come your way. Yes. Now, before we go into the reason why we need logical access controls, I think it's important we understand what we're trying to protect: information assets. Yeah. If you ask an accountant what assets are, they'll probably list things like plant and machinery. And for IT, when we talk about things like your network, your data, your software. The applications, I know the organization I used to work with before, a particular core business application which costs over $100 million. So these are some of the assets that we're looking at protecting. Now, the next question is, what are logical access controls? Now, looking at access controls, let us understand that there are 2 types of access controls. We have physical access controls. And in fact, the beauty of protection of information asset is this is a very practical subject that you interact with every day. Now, there are 2 types of access controls, and you would agree with me that you've seen some of this in your everyday life. When you get to your place of work and you need to get into access your premise, you have to pass through your security guards. Now, that is physical access control. Sometimes they might ask you to show your badge, your ID card, before you're allowed access, or sometimes they will ask you to sign in a register, to show that you're being granted access into that premise. But on the other side, we're now looking at logical access. Logical access deals with mechanisms used to restrict access to your systems, your applications, and data to only authorized users. Now, because it's logical access, it means the access controls we are talking about are technology-based that makes sure that only the right people can have access to company data, system. Now, examples of some of these logical access controls. Now, you can fact check me here. When you get into your office, you see that on your system, before you're able to gain access to your files in your computer, you have to enter your username and password. Now, that is an example of a logical access control. We have things like firewalls. The essence of firewall is to monitor traffic coming into the network and traffic going out of a particular network. We also have things like user accounts. Now, when you're employed in an organization, you're usually assigned an account because that is how they can track what you do on the application or within the network. And finally, we'll have things like log monitoring. Now, every system, and it's best practice, every system has what is called, logging. And it's there to account for what users do on a particular system. So when you get into your office and you put in your username and password, the system logs that, yes, you have signed into the system with your correct username and password. And of course, if you've entered the wrong password, it will also log it that, yes, you have entered the wrong password, and then it will throw up an error. And it will tell you that either the username or password is wrong. And the reason why it does this is, is clear. It is it's something we can call security by design. And why it does that is because by not specifying which detail is wrong, hackers or malicious users cannot confirm if the account exists on that system or not. So you can imagine if you enter a wrong password and the system tells you that the password you have entered is wrong, then the person who has entered that password will know that, yes, okay, that means the username is correct. The issue now lies with the password. Now, let's take an example. We have a fintech in Lagos. Its app uses the password and OTP to ensure that only authenticated users can have access to the mobile wallet. Now, this is an example of logical access control because now you're entering two details. One is your password and an OTP, right? Now, the review question for this particular page is, what one system in your workplace requires what we can, basically call a digital padlock? And, what do you think would happen if this is left open? Can anyone, in the class, speak to us about this? What system in your company, that requires a digital padlock? By digital padlock, I mean it requires a username and password for you to gain access. And then what do you think would happen if that system doesn't have a username and password? Anyone can answer, please.
Our emails required login to enter.
Yes, that's great. Okay, so that is one application that requires your email and then possibly a password. Thank you very much for that. So what are the fundamentals of logical access controls? Now, the objective of every access control is, one, to ensure that only authorized users gain access, and two, to provide appropriate levels of access. Because I mean, you can relate with me here that in the organization, the access the CFO has is not the same access the account officer has. There are two different access levels. And another control objective is to ensure that only is to prevent unauthorized disclosure or modification of information. And then finally, to maintain accountability. And the way it maintains accountability is by logging user activities. We spoke about this in the previous slide, right? Now let's look at the core components of logical access. Now, the core components you see on the screen are some of the things that logical access, helps us to answer. The first one is identification, and it asks the questions, who are you? So in the previous example, a participant gave us, she said, email. In order to access your email, when you get into that particular page, it will ask you for your username. And that is asking the question, who are you, right? Then the password is now saying, prove it. And that is authentication. You prove your identity by putting the correct password. Now, let's say we're looking at a particular application. The next core component of logical access is saying authorization, which means what can you do when you get in? I gave an example earlier. In a financial application like Sage, Sage is basically used for financial reporting. The access the CFO has or the head of account has on Sage is going to be different from the authorization an account officer has. So while an account officer can maybe post transactions, the CFO or head of accounts can approve transactions, and that is basically another control called segregation of incompatible duties, which means you do not give one person end-to-end access to a particular system. And what that means is the CFO should not be able to enter a transaction and approve that same transaction, right? It is called segregation of duties. And then the fourth component, the four core components of logical access is accountability, which asks the question, what did you do when you gain access into the system, right? And this is where the audit log comes to play. So from the time you log into a system to when you post one or two transactions to when you log out of a system, all of those activities are logged in the audit log. And of course, someone also needs to review that log. Now, the risk of weak controls would be privilege abuse, where a privileged user could abuse the access he or she has. We have things like data breaches, we have unauthorized transactions, and we have insider threats, right? Now, moving on to the next slide. Why do companies need logical access controls? I mean, why should we even bother to protect what we have? Now, the core of logical access rests on what we call the CIA triad. The CIA triad stands for the C there. It's actually an acronym. The C stands for confidentiality, the I stands for integrity, and the A stands for availability. Confidentiality speaks to unauthorized. It means nobody, unauthorized user should not be able to make modifications to data. Integrity means that what has been entered into the system should not change. And availability means that users must have access to that data whenever they need that data. Of course, one of the other reasons why we need logical access control is to reduce fraud and cybercrime. And of course, we have regulatory issues such as the NDPA, NDPR in the case of Nigeria. South Africa is POPIA, which basically helps to ensure that companies are in compliance with data protection regulations. And of course, the need for logical access also covers accountability. When people do things on the system, they should actually be held accountable for what they have done on the system. And then finally, to prevent insider misuse. Now, an example we have here is, we all have bank accounts. You can imagine if someone could, go into your account and take money without your permission, right? What are some of the controls, that a bank can put in place to ensure that that cannot happen? These are some of the reasons why organizations need logical access. Now, the question for this slide is, which department in your organization handles the most sensitive information, and what should protect them? So I'll give an example here. So I started my career in consulting. I moved to the public sector. I went into utilities, and now I'm in the health space. Now, one of the things I've seen, one of the organizations that handles data, the most sensitive data, is actually commercial, and that's because they handle customer data. Customer data is actually very sensitive. So we have customer data, we have transaction data. I just gave an example a few minutes ago. You can imagine that, let's say you work in a bank, and someone from the back end, let's say IT, and go into a customer's account and change the closing balance from 1,000 to 100 million, right? In that case, you see that there are no controls to ensure the CIA triad, which goes to the first need for access controls. And of course, it also helps to reduce fraud and crime. This is why we need access controls. I'll give you an example. I used to work in an organization. I was actually called in to, set up and lead the IT audit unit. And one of the first things we did was to take stock of all the information assets. And then we went to a particular location to discover that one of the servers was missing, which was the very first red flag. Now, one of the controls that we also found was breached was what I alluded to earlier. It's called segregation of incompatible duties, where on a trading floor, you have a revenue accountant who has access to a particular system. And then you have an account officer who also has access to that system. But because the revenue accountant was not tech savvy, she gave her credentials to the account officer rather, who then use that access to commit fraud, right? So you see that the breach of controls here, which was that segregation of duties, has led to the commission of fraud, of course, to the benefit of the account officer, right? So these are some of the reasons why we need logical access controls. And of course, it also helps to ensure that the financial records are intact as well. Now, let's look at identity and access management. This is, for short, it's called IAM. So IAM stands for Identity and Access Management, and the IAM covers provisioning, deprovisioning, privileged access management, and directory services. I'll give you an example. Let's say you work in Access Bank, right? What provisioning means is you have just joined the bank as a new staff. Provisioning means, and let's say you join the bank as a marketer. So provisioning is where IT, right, gives you access to the system based on your job role. And it basically speaks to the fourth item here, which is directory services. Directory services is a centralized database that helps to store, manage, and organize information about users, devices, and network resources. In fact, you can just call it a phone book for IT. And that's what IT uses to enable secure authentication, authorization, and resource location across an entire organization. An example of directory services would be Microsoft Active Directory. Now, when a new staff is employed, you typically see a situation where HR will raise a provisioning request to say, Mr. Lagbaja has just joined our audit team, for instance, and he needs access to, various system resources. Now, based on the approval of that request by the department's HOD, IT can then go ahead to now create an account, a user account for Mr. Lagbaja. So you typically see something like, depending on their naming convention, some people will use your first name dot your last name. Some will just use the first initial of your name and then your surname at the domain. The domain will now be at accessbank, maybe nigeria.com, or it could be your first name and your last name together at accessbank.com. So that process is called provisioning, right? Now, the provisioning simply is the reverse of provisioning. Mr. Lagbaja has worked in Access Bank for, let's say, 10 years, and he has decided to go to First Bank, which means he's retired, he's resigning his appointment with Access Bank. So the provisioning is the process where IT would revoke access to Access Bank systems. And of course, it is not just resignation. Sometimes when a person's appointment is terminated, either for fraud or whatever reason, the provisioning happens as well. And sometimes when that person, let's say Mr. Lagbaja is leaving corporate banking and is going into risk management, the provisioning happens as well, because if it doesn't happen, it means he would have what is, it's called permission creep, where you are in a particular department, you have the access of that department, you move to another department, and they do not remove access from your former department. They give you more access to the new department. It then means you have both access as an operations staff, and then in that new department you're going to, they're also giving you more access. And where they do not remove the previous access, you can have things like permission. We spoke about it in the previous slide. It's called privilege abuse, right? And that is an example of weak access controls, permission abuse. Now, privileged access management speaks to some of the very powerful users within an organization. Now, remember that IT is the one providing the platform on which the business runs. So IT has provided the core business application. IT is the one supporting the user department in terms of creating users or deprovisioning users. Now, because IT has such powerful access, someone needs to be able to review what IT is doing on the system. And that is basically what number 3 speaks to. It's called privileged access management, because IT basically has what is called keys to the kingdom. They're the ones who have access to the back end to add users, to remove users, to block users, to do a whole lot of things in the system. So there is need for the internal audit or IT audit, as it were, to monitor what these privileged users do in the system, right? I hope this explanation has driven home the point. Yeah. Now, one of the things in practical terms right now, identity and access management lifecycle failure is a common audit finding, where, and I'll give you a practical example. During one of my audits, we've seen where a staff was laid off, like in January 2025, and the provisioning did not happen, which means that that staff still had access to company data, to company systems. And along the line, someone used that access to commit fraud, which is why I have put it here that I mean, IAM lifecycle failures are a common audit finding. It's that a person has also moved from Department A to Department D, and IT did not, or whoever was responsible did not revoke the access of that person when he was still in Department A. So which means the staff has now moved to Department D, and they have given the staff, the new staff now, the access required for work in Department D, while that staff still retains access to do work in Department A. I hope you get the analogy there, right? Now, there are critical life cycle controls I want us to look at here. When a person joins an organization, they're basically called joiners. So IT grants access. When that staff, let's call that staff Mr. John. Mr. John has joined a microfinance bank and he's in the accounts department. As he joined the bank, IT will grant access based on that role that he has been given access to, right? Now, if after 6 months they decide that they need a staff in risk management and they want to transfer John from finance to risk department, John's access needs to be adjusted. This is where the provisioning happens, right? Because you cannot leave John with access in accounts and give new access in risk management. That will lead to privilege abuse. So number 2 simply means that access needs to be adjusted. They remove old access and then they grant access in a new department. And of course, we have leavers. Leavers are those leaving an organization, whether it is through death, maybe the person is dead, or the person retires, or the person resigns, or the person's appointment is terminated or dismissed, or that person dismissed. The access needs to be removed. Again, failure in leaver process is one of the biggest risks that we have seen, where a person leaves the system either by death, resignation, retirement, or termination, and the access to company data is not removed, right? That's one of the biggest risks that we have seen in recent times, right? Now, user provisioning. Okay, I think I spoke to this earlier when we talked about it. When a new employee joins an organization, IT has to create an account with the access that that person requires. Now, some of the key controls we're looking at, just like I alluded to before, was approval from HR and the manager of the department the person is going to. We have things like identity verification. We have role-based access. We have least privileged principal, and we have documented access requests. Again, this is one of the areas where, in practical terms, we have seen a lot of control failures. We've seen cases where people are granted access without documentation. So how do we know when this person was first granted access and who approved that access? That is where documentation comes in, right? Now, the example we have here is at MTN Nigeria, a customer service staff gets access to SIM registration module, but not to the billing database. Now, this is an example of a role-based access control, and it is based on the principle of least privilege, which means, it's like a school, right? You only give the class prefect the key to only the classroom that they supervise, not all the classrooms, right? That is called principle of least privilege. Now, my question for you now is, think of a job role in your company. What access do you think that person should not have? Can anyone respond to this? Just think of any job role within your company or where you worked previously, and what access do you think that that job role should not have? Can anybody respond to this?
Come again, please.
I didn't get that. Could you say that again?
Please.
Okay, let me quickly respond. For instance, now, as
Okay.
a billing officer, someone who bills, invoice, who places orders for customer, you should not have the access to change the price of the goods on the system.
Wow, that's perfect. Perfect. I love that analogy. And that basically speaks to what I talked about before. And that is based on the principle of least privilege, which means that billing officer is given access to the model he or she requires for that billing purpose alone. And that person should not be able to, go into the system to change price or do any other thing, right? Yes, so thank you very much for that. Now, I believe I've spoken to the provisioning, which means removing access. Now, access, like I said before, is the provision is also a control. Access must be removed when a user resigns, when they change department. Like I said, the person moved from billing to operations, the access needs to be removed, or when they stop needing the system, or when that person's appointment is terminated, or when the person retires, perhaps from service. Now, some of the controls we have is HR has to notify IT so that at the right time, that's at the effective date of the person's resignation, the IT department can disable that person's user access. And then, of course, from the audit perspective, there has to be like a monthly review of inactive accounts, because access was given so that people can use those access to do things on the system. So when an account is inactive, it's either the person is not doing the work he or she is supposed to do, because obviously you need that access to gain access to the system, do something on the application and all of that. But that account is inactive. It's either the person is dead, maybe person is in a remote location, person is dead or has left the system or has absconded, in which case the monthly review of inactive accounts really should ideally throw up all of these exceptions. And this is something we have also seen as well. I'll give you an example. In my previous place, one of the places I used to work, we were doing a monthly review of inactive accounts. And I just joined that organization recently, so we did like a 1-year review. And then we discovered that a particular account had not been used for about 8 months. And then when we now began to dig into that account, we now discovered that there was an approval from the MD for that staff to go on what's it called now? Is it education leave? I think it's called like some kind of education leave where the person can go on leave for study purposes, but of course without pay. But what we now discovered also was that HR did not notify IT to disable the account, and then an account was also not notified to stop salary. So for 8 months, the guy was not coming to work based on approval, and he was getting salaries, right? So reviews like this will throw up exceptions like this, because we're able to even recover the money from the affected staff and all of that. Now, an example here is this: a Ghanaian telecom discovered that ex-staff still had access to internal systems for months, creating a major fraud risk. This is actually a real-world example. Oh, sorry. This is actually a real-world example. Unfortunately, we do not have so much of these examples from Nigeria because a whole lot of companies do not report. And by regulation, when a cyber fraud occurs, companies are mandated to report to the NDPR. But that is also not happening, and so we cannot benefit from shared knowledge. So a whole lot of examples that we're using here are examples from outside the country, and of course, personal experiences, right? Now, my question for you here is this: why is it dangerous if a former staff still has access to your system? It's possible you work in a bank, it's possible you work with a telco, an insurance company, a hospital, wherever you work. Why do you think it's dangerous if a former staff, the guy obviously no longer works with you? Why do you think it would be dangerous if that person still has access to your systems? Anyone can respond, please.
Yes, Olma, good afternoon. Let me quickly respond to that. The person may be an intruder, or the person may liaise with somebody to attack the organization. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that. So it basically aligns with some of the things we talked about earlier, right? Where we talked about the risk of fraud and cyber crime. So when the person still, of course, a former staff still has access to your system, it could result to fraud and cyber crime, right? That is the risk. Okay. So moving on. Part of identity and access management, we have authentication controls. Now, depending on whatever policy you have in your organization, your password control would basically tell you that, okay, your password should be maybe 8 characters, 10 characters, and it will also speak to the complexity. Complexity, speaks to the incorporation of the mix of either lowercase, uppercase, numbers, and special characters, right? And then, of course, the policy will also speak to things like password history, account lockout. That's how many times should you enter a wrong password before the system should lock you out. In some organizations I worked with before, it is 3 wrong attempts. So when you enter the wrong password once, it will tell you you have 2 tries left. If you try it again, it tells you have 1 more try left. And if you enter the wrong password the 3rd time, it will lock you out, which means you then need IT to come in to reset your password. So it's actually a control, it's a password control, to help when either somebody steals your laptop or your system, or someone is trying to access your account from another device, right? And of course, password history policy will tell you that, okay, you cannot reuse your last 5 passwords, right? So let's say in January you had a particular password, and your policy also says you have to change your password every 30 days, which means by March, you cannot use that password used in January because it has a password history of 5, which means the only time you can reuse password is maybe from maybe June. You can then begin to reuse passwords, right? So that's what password history, talks about here. Then, of course, we have multi-factor authentication, and that's MFA and 2FA. Now, it is important to understand that all 2FA is MFA, but not all MFA is 2FA. I'm going to explain that maybe in the next slide, right? Now, imagine that the example we have here, that federal government, portals now enforce password complexity to prevent, password hacking attempts. Now, I have a question for you. Is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 a safe password? Why not? What makes a password strong? Can anyone speak to this question? I'm trying to set up my account, and I'm putting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and of course, the reason is obvious. A whole lot of people have several accounts, and memorizing several passwords is usually a problem, which is why some people just basically just use a simple password such as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So is this a safe password? And what makes a password strong? Anyone can respond, please.
Okay, good morning.
Yeah, good morning.
Yeah, so it's not a safe password because it's something that can easily be guessed by anyone. I can just decide to come and try 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it's easier for me to get it. But a safer password is alphanumeric with symbols. I think that one is more safer because it's difficult for anyone to just guess the way you the sequence of your password.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's very correct. So sometimes that's why we have things like account lockout. Account lockout acts as a complementary control. So your primary control is your password complexity. So your password complexity says, as per your policy, that your password should be, should have 10 characters, and it should be a mix of uppercase, lowercase, number, special characters would include things like at, star, asterisk, and things like that. Now, a complementary control would be account lockout. So if someone is trying to guess your password, like let's say I don't know what your password is, right? And I'm just trying to guess your password on a particular system. I tried the first time, it says it is wrong, right? I tried the second time, and I spoke about security by design earlier, and this is a case where when you enter a wrong password, the system will not tell you that where it is correctly implemented anyway. The system will not tell you that you've entered the wrong password. It will tell you that your password or username may be incorrect. So you right now, you're not even sure. Is it that the username is wrong or is it that the password is wrong? Remember, if the system told you, if the system gave you a specific response to say the password you entered is wrong or the username you entered is wrong, then you know where the problem is, right? So the system will give a generic message to tell you that your username or password may be incorrect. And as per the NSIT, the NSIT is the national, what's the meaning of NSIT? So we have the NIST, the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? The NIST recommends changing your password every 60 to 90 days. And of course, this is implemented through the system. So once it's approaching the period you have to change your password, you begin to see a notification. Okay, your password is due for change in 5 days, in 4 days. You keep seeing that pop up until when you want to try to log in, it will tell you that you have to change your password, right? So thank you very much for that. Now, we talked about multi-factor authentication. Multi-factor authentication, which is MFA, is a security framework that requires users to provide 2 or more independent and distinct type of evidence, which we call factors, to prove their identity before they can access the account. Now, I also talked about 2-factor authentication, and I said all 2-factor authentication is multi-factor authentication, but not all multi-factor authentication is 2-factor authentication, and I'll explain why. The reason is this: 2-factor is a subset of MFA, and then it only requires you to provide only 2 of these factors. Now, let me just tell you what these factors are, right? The factors are something you know. What you know could be your password, your PIN, if you're using like a banking app that requires you to put in a PIN, or some security question. And then another factor is something you have. Like if you use GT Bank, for instance, you typically have either a physical token or a soft token. A soft token is the one you generate from a particular application on your phone or an app. And then something you are. Something you are speaks to biometrics, like your face scan, voice recognition, iris scan, fingerprint, and all of that. So in terms of 2-factor authentication, it will ask you to provide your PIN. In the case of GT, for instance, like let me use my GT for instance. If I'm trying to sign into my GT account, it will ask for my PIN, which is something I know. Then it will ask me for something that I have. I have a physical token, a GT token. once I press, I enter the token from that, I enter the number from that, excuse me, enter the number from the token. That is 2FA. But multi-factor authentication, it's a higher level of security. So for instance, my email account, because I'm the head of IT audit, it is protected by all 3 factors. So first of all, I have to put in my password. It will ask me for a token. Then it will also now ask me for my fingerprints before I can gain access to my account. I hope this explanation clarifies the difference between multi-factor authentication and 2-factor authentication, right? Now, there are different access control models. One is called the DAC, which is discretionary access control. DAC is a case where, let's say in the company, let's say we work with AB Microfinance Bank, and I'm in operations. So I actually own a particular system. Now, as the owner of that system, when I mean owner, my department is the primary user of that system. Because I own that application, I as user, I can decide who should have, access rights to my own application. Now, while this is flexible in terms of giving access, the controls are weak because again, it is discretionary. I can decide to give you access. I can also decide not to give a particular user access, right? Then another model we have is called the MAC, which is the mandatory access control. Now, this one is based on classification. Of course, the security is very strong, but is less flexible. This one is mostly used by the military environments. Once an application has been classified as either A, B, or C, and they say A, it is only generals that can have access to it. I don't know a whole lot of us, but I've seen this in movies. It is only a general that can have access to that particular application, whether you need it or not. Nobody will give you access except you're a general. So the security is very strong, but it is really not flexible because, it is military grade kind of thing. Then we have role-based access control. This one is based on job roles. Like I said earlier, this is also scalable and it's easier to administer. One of the applications used to manage role-based access control would be something like Microsoft Active Directory. So what it means is, okay, let me give an instance. I used to work with a utility that had about 5,000 staff. So you can imagine trying to use discretionary access control in an environment like that. It will be very risky because users can be granted access without oversight. But with role-based access, we have 5,000 staff. If you're coming in as a cashier, there's a particular role called cashier role. They will simply just put you in that bucket. So users are classified based on buckets. So it's okay, you're a cashier, we'll put in this cashier bucket. So meaning you can do what only cashiers can do. You have about 200 revenue accountants. Once you're coming in as a revenue accountant, we'll put you in that bucket, which means you can only do what revenue accountants can do. You cannot do what a cashier can do because you're not a cashier. You've been put into that bucket. If you're coming in as an auditor, where they're about 200 or 100, they'll put you in that bucket, auditor's bucket, which means you only and not, right? So that is called role-based access control. It's based on the role that you're coming into the organization to do. And this one basically supports segregation of duties, like I mentioned earlier. In fact, not just segregation of duties, it's called segregation of incompatible duties, which means the role that an accountant plays should not be the same role that a cashier plays. These two roles are incompatible. They cannot, which means they cannot be done by the same person. If you allow one person to do both roles, that would result to privilege abuse. It means somebody as an account officer can post a transaction And as a revenue accountant, the person can approve that transaction. And of course, that will lead to fraud and financial misstatement. Yeah? Now, the fourth control model we have is called attribute-based access control. I've only seen this in a very few places. This was
Please, I want
implemented.
to ask a question.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, so based on your last explanation, for companies that are short-staffed, they're just newly set up companies and they're actually short-staffed, what do they do in that situation where they don't want to give access, like multiple access to just one person?
Okay, fine. This is where the auditor comes in, right? If you're short-staffed, of course, the auditor is supposed to pick that as an exception to say that these two roles are incompatible, which means there's a likelihood or there's increased chance of fraud occurring, which means there has to be more scrutiny in the activity of that individual. Pending when they're going to, of course, the auditor also needs to highlight the risk of having one person carry out the activities of two separate offices, because those two duties are incompatible. They cannot be done by one person. Okay, let me give an example here, right? In my previous role, there's a role called revenue accountant. So the way it works is once the cashier collects money for the day, so once the cashier collects money for the day, right, and he or she does at the end of the day, they do their reconciliation, and everybody signs off on that document to say, okay, we've made a sale of 3 million naira. There's a person called a clearing cashier. The job of that clearing cashier is to carry that money and take it to the bank, right? And then come back with slip and all of that to the revenue accountant. But we had a situation where there was no clearing cashier. And then the revenue accountant was doing the job of a clearing cashier, which means the revenue accountant will go and collect the money and take it to the bank. But what we then discovered was, again, you see that these two roles are incompatible. You cannot be a clearing cashier and the revenue accountant at the same time. What we discovered was that if you must have heard of the fraud triangle, right? The fraud triangle basically gives reasons why people carry out fraud. We have the rationalization, I'm underpaid, I'm overworked. We have incentive. So there was an incentive for that person to carry out that fraud. So what the woman did was she was basically doctoring. She was not taking the money to the bank. In fact, the day she was arrested, we found 9 million under her table, cash, 9 million. So she was not taking the money to the bank. She was basically doctoring the bank statement in connivance with somebody from the bank. So this is an example of a case of fraud where you have one person carrying out the duties of two persons, and those two roles are they are not compatible. They should not be done by the same person. By all standards, they should not be done by the same person. So what that is happening is, well, it's a big risk, and that's where the auditor, should come in to say, this is a risk. If this risk crystallizes, this is what we stand to suffer and all of that. The business will suffer in, naira and couple terms, and of course, we also have things like reputational damage, brand damage to brand and all of that. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you. Okay, so like I talked about earlier, attribute-based access control. Now, like I said, this was where we've implemented this, my previous role. And this is where we're saying, okay, we had cashiers, and that is something the CBN is also trying to do right now to geofence POS operators, because a lot of fraud has happened on POS machines. So they're now saying, if you've been given a POS machine to work in Ikeja, or if let's even be very specific, let's say around Olowu in Ikeja, you cannot move that machine to Ojota, for instance, and it will work. So restriction to use that device is based on your location, right? There are other companies who have implemented this based on time. I don't know if anyone in the room can give us an example, but there are companies where once it's 6 o'clock, you can't access their system wherever you are. They shut down by 6 p.m. So if you try to log in by 7 p.m., you can't go in, because by that time they have to also run their own end of day at the back. So at that point, you can't even access the system. So that is now done based on time. So time is the attribute. The other example I gave, device or location is the attribute. Then there are some times when you start working in the company like let's say AB Microfinance Bank, and you are the branch manager. They give you a laptop. You cannot access that company's application outside that laptop, outside that device. It is only on that device. It's been configured as such. And it's almost similar to rule-based access controls, which is abbreviated as RBAC. Now, RBAC grants access to users based on predefined rules like time of day or IP address or device type. That's why I said it's similar to attribute-based. So sometimes time of day, you cannot log into the system except it's 8 a.m. in the morning. So from 8 a.m. you can log in, and at a particular time you might not be able to log in. And sometimes you can only log in based on your IP address. So if you're not within the company premises, so that the server assigns you an IP address, you cannot sign into that application. These are just ways that companies use to restrict access to their information, to their systems, so that a hacker cannot bring his own laptop and try to access that particular system or application, right? Now, of course, role-based access controls. Okay, we've talked about this. I said role-based access is granted based on job role, not on individual. So I gave the example earlier. If you're an accountant, they'll put in that bucket for accountants, which means you can only do what accountants can do. And like I said, it supports segregation of incompatible duties to improve security. For instance, bank tellers in a bank, for instance, cannot approve large transactions. Only supervisors, that have that role can approve it. In my previous organization, in fact, the only person that can approve things like salary payments is the CFO, because the salary payment represents one of the highest in terms of volume, payments that is made on a monthly basis. So that transaction cannot just be approved by anybody. It has to be approved by the CFO, right? So the accountants can only, raise or HR can only raise the payroll, but the approval still lies with the CFO. So that basically supports what we call segregation of incompatible duties, right? All right. Now, these are past questions based on what we just talked about on authorization controls. The question says, which of the following is the best preventative control to ensure that database integrity is maintained? We have mandatory annual user reviews, biometric authentication, role-based, and we have mandatory password changes. Can anyone in the house speak to this? It's a past user question, and it speaks to authorization controls.
In my own view, I think biometric authentication is the best preventive control.
Does anyone have a contrary opinion?
Yes, in my own case, I would say C, role-based access control.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any contrary opinion? Okay, so let me just give you a pro tip. Sometimes in this star question, you see a word in bold letters, in capital letters, which means 2 or 3 of them might be correct, but there's one that is the best in terms of being a preventative control. Now, remember that we've been talking about in the last 30 minutes or so, we've been talking about authorization controls. Of course, annual review is also a control, but annual review is what? What kind of control is that? It's post, it's after the fact, right? So it is detective, that's a detective control because it is happening after access has already been granted and things have been done. You're only going in there to look at what the users did. Biometric is simply a way of, granting users access to the system by maybe your fingerprint, retinal eye scan, voice, or facial recognition. Now, mandatory password changes. Remember that we're talking about a control to ensure that database integrity is maintained. Now, the correct answer is role-based access control because role-based is a preventative control that restricts access based on job function, which means it is only those who have the necessary access can have permission to do what they need to do in the system. I hope that explains it, right? Let's look at another one. An organization is using an ERP application. Which of the following would be an effective access control? Is it assigning permissions based on user roles? Is it implementing user level permissions for all employees or allowing data owners to assign permissions directly? Remember, this C speaks to discretionary access control because the data owners are the ones assigning permissions, right? Or utilizing mandatory access controls. Anyone can answer, please. Look at the second part. Which one will be the effective access control?
Okay, for me, I would say A, assigning permissions based on user roles.
Does anyone have a contrary opinion? Okay.
I would say
Yes.
D. So there's a mandatory access control before you can even get access at all. There is something that you have to fulfill before you can gain access. So I'll say D.
Okay, thank you very much for your response. But the correct answer is A. You assign roles, you assign permission based on user roles. So an ERP, well, I hope most of us have ERPs in our organizations. ERP is the enterprise resource, management application that handles a whole lot of. So ERP is basically like how do I put it now? You can call it like a building, right? Look at it like a building. One room is HR, another room is operations, another room is IT, another room is technical, but everything is all together in one place. That is what ERP is. So it helps the accountants, they're able to do their own job within a module in the ERP. The auditor is within his own module is also able to do his own checks. The CFO within her own module is also able to do her own role or his or her own role. So everybody has different roles to play within the ERP because they are in different departments. And so the best way to manage access control is to assign permission based on your user role, right? So the correct answer is A. Remember we talked about this, about a few minutes ago, right? Particularly where you have large number of users. C, for instance, speaks to DAC, which is discretionary access control, where if I'm let's say the HOD of account, I own Sage application, which is for financial reporting. I can decide to grant Mr. Lagbaja access. I can decide not to grant access because it is my application. So it is discretionary. It's just based on the data owner or the owner of the application, right? So the correct answer in this instance is A, assigning permissions based on user role. So you see that there's a twist in the response. They didn't call it role-based access control. They will just say assigning permissions based on user role. It is the same as role-based access controls. Another question. During an audit of a HR application, the IS auditor finds that many users have excessive access rights. What is the most effective way to address this? Remember, the word in bold letters, most.
For me, I would say B, implement rule-based access control.
Any contrary opinion?
I'll pick B too.
Any other contrary opinion? I'm listening. Any other opinion? Okay, so this question here basically speaks to a violation of the principle of least privilege, where users have excessive access rights, right? So if the IS auditor is an external auditor, what it's supposed to do is to document the findings, evaluate the risks, and recommend, that they conduct a formal user access review to restrict permissions, and then of course implement role-based access controls, right? All right. Let's see if we have any other question. All right. Now the last question, I think. A firm is moving from DAC, that discretionary access control, to role-based access control. What is the primary benefit for the auditor? Anyone can answer, please.
It will
I would go
simplify the
for
management of user permissions.
Sorry, I didn't get that.
B.
Okay. Any contrary opinion? Any contrary opinion? Okay, so moving from
B.
discretionary
B.
access. Okay, thank you very much. So moving from discretionary access control, discretionary is where the owner of the system is the one assigning permission. To a role-based access control will basically simplify management of user permissions, which is B. All right, thank you very much. Okay, let's look at segregation of incompatible duties, SOD. Now, this basically means that one employee should not have the ability to create a transaction, review it, and approve it. So what SOD basically does is to split maker checker, basically creates maker checker. The person who initiates should not be the person who approves. The person who develops a system should not be the person who would deploy it, right? Now, an example we have here is a Lagos microfinance bank uses segregation of duties to avoid loan officers from approving their own entries. So this is a clear case where you're a loan officer in, let's say, AB Microfinance Bank. When you raise a loan request for a particular customer, you should not be the same person to approve it. Because if you do, it means there's no maker checker or there's no initiator versus approver, right? So one of the control is to put an initiator where the loan officer initiates the entries to say, I have a client who wants a loan of, based on their policy, wants a loan of 2 million, everything checks out. And then the supervisor can then review and approve, right? Now, a question for discussion is describe one process in your team that could cause, issues if one person did all the steps, like end to end. Can anyone guide us in this exercise? Is there any process within your team where if one person did it, like started it and closed it, that would cause an issue?
I'll say putting and approving of journals for financial
Okay.
statement.
Great. That's a perfect example. Great. Anyone else? So I like the example you just gave, and it's it's clear that there is segregation of duties where you have a maker and a checker, or where someone initiates and another person approves. Then in terms of software development, a person who develops an application, let's say you are into maybe e-hailing, that's ride hailing, right? And then you have a developer who has developed an application for you. That same developer should not be the same person that should deploy that ride hailing app for you, right? And that goes to show that there's segregation of duties. Okay, moving on. Now there's a question on SOD. If the person who reconciles an organization's device inventory also performs another task, which of the following tasks would cause the greatest SOD concern? Let me repeat that. In your organization, the person who reconciles device inventory also performs another task. Which of the following tasks would cause the greatest? Mind you, the greatest is in bold letters. Would cause the greatest SOD concern? Issuing devices to employees, tracking devices used for spare parts, approving the issuing of devices, and creating the device policy. Anyone can answer.
I would say the approving the issuing of devices.
Okay. Any contrary opinion? Does anyone have a contrary opinion? Okay. So C is correct. And the reason is because a significant SOD conflict will arise when that same individual who is performing, remember, reconciliation is a detective control. You are reconciling, and yet they're also the same person approving, which is like the authorization control. You are the one approving the issuance of those items. So you cannot be the one approving and also reconciling, being in charge of the two process. That would create potential cover up for unauthorized activity. So that is very correct. C is correct. Now, question 2. In a controlled application development environment, that is, we're developing an application, the most important SOD should be between the person who implements changes into production environment and what other role? Anybody can answer. Anyone can answer.
Application programmer for me, A, application programmer.
Do you have a contrary opinion? Okay, so the answer is correct. It's application programmer, and the reason is this. You see, to maintain proper control over the production environment, a key segregation of duty is between the person who does the programming, which is the application programmer, and the person who has authority to move those changes into production, because this will prevent unauthorized or untested code from being deployed. So that's A is correct. Okay. Now, remember we've talked about login. Now, login is almost meaningless if you do not monitor it, right? Now, what does the log record? When you get into a system, you put in your username and password, your identity is logged, right? And then what you did in the system is also logged. So if you typically look at an audit log, you will see that at 8 a.m., Mr. Lagbaja logged in. So that is identity. And then what did you do on the system? You changed customer address from number A to number C to show what you have done. And when this happened, which is the date time, you show that this activity happened on the 1st of January 2026 by, so date time is the day month that it happened and also the time. So it's okay, 10 a.m. It even goes down to seconds to show when that activity was done. And then if there are also failed attempts, you're trying to log into the account, you put in the wrong password, it will also log that activity. Now, the controls with log record is one, those logs have to be stored safely. And two, those logs have to be reviewed. There's no need keeping logs if those logs are not going to be. And of course, we have retention. How long should you keep logs? Because log is something that grows exponentially. You can imagine that you work in a bank and the bank has, let's say, 500 staff. So 500 staff, every day they log into the system, to do one or two things, and they log out. And the system keeps logging all of those things. You see that within 1 week that your log size would have grown to maybe 5 terabytes. And that's just for 1 week. So you can imagine what you have for 1 month, what you have for 6 months. So for how long should you keep these logs? Because logs basically serve as a repository for maybe forensic review and all of that. But it's important that these logs are also reviewed and automated alerts are sent. So if there are things that stand out, things like failed login attempts, those alerts should be created for such events. Because the log has so many entries, so you can't possibly just be looking at the entirety of the log. But there are certain things that should stand out for an IT auditor. Things like failed login attempts, which will point to you that is it possible that someone else is trying to gain unauthorized access to somebody's account? And things like that. So the question here is, if someone misused the system yesterday, how would you be able to prove it without the logs? Can anyone attempt that question? Someone logged into your system and did something yesterday. How would you be able to prove it without logs? Anyone can answer.
You won't be able to prove it because the logs are the evidence that the person actually accessed the system.
Yes, thank you very much. So the logs provide evidence to prove what is called non-repudiation. So non-repudiation, simply says that you cannot deny what was done or an activity that was done using your credentials, right? That is basically what non-repudiation talks about. Now, earlier we talked about privileged account management. Now, privileged accounts are basically the system administrators. Remember those guys who administer the system, IT. They basically have keys to the kingdom. They have the access right to even see what any person does on the system. So it's important to be able to, from an audit perspective, it's important to be able to know what those guys are doing in the system, which is where privileged accounts or access monitoring comes in. But of course, there are controls to look at this because it is not something you do manually. There are tools used for privileged access monitoring. We have things like CyberArk, we have Beyond Trust. These are basically applications that will help to record what those privileged users do on the system. It can even be used to do what is called time-based access, which means those privileged users you can restrict when they access the system. So you cannot have a privileged user like maybe IT accessing your core business application around 12 midnight. It's out of place for your administrator to be accessing your core business application, by 12 midnight, 1 a.m., 2 a.m. So some of these they're basically called PAM, privileged account management tools, such as CyberArk, Beyond Trust, and all of that can be used to prevent privileged users from accessing your core business application, a certain time. And of course, there's what we call break glass accounts. We have session recording. These are things that can be done with these PAM tools. Now, there's an example here. Kenyan data centers use PAM to track what system administrators do on cloud servers, right? Now, the question for you is this: why must admin actions be monitored more strictly than regular users? Anyone can answer. Why should admin accounts, why should the actions of admins be monitored more strictly than regular accounts?
Well, to me, I think it's because they have privileged access. So we should look into what they do more. They can restrict, they can add, remove, they can change a lot of things. So because of that right of privileged access is the reason why we need to check them the more.
Yes, thank you very much. That's true. So, the admins are like school principals. They have the master keys. They have keys to all the classes. So they actually must watch what they do. And I'll give you an example. There's a particular company, a friend of mine, worked there, and then they had an admin to a system that they were developing in-house. And that's what the admin did now was, because they were at the testing stage, what he did was to show up his own wallet. So what the system is supposed to do is customers should be able to vend on the system. You should be able to pay their bills on the system, right? Now, because the guy was a developer, he had a wallet. And the essence of having that wallet, just like every other customer should have a wallet, was to enable him test those transactions. So we would try to say, okay, can I pay for this? Can I pay for item A? Can I pay for item B? That's the essence of having that wallet, to test the transactions. But what the guy did was to increase his wallet balance to over ₦1 million, and he was now using it to buy things, right? Which was a clear violation. So as per system development standards, even where you have a wallet and you need to test transactions, you're not even supposed to have more than 300 naira in your wallet. That's another control, because the transactions or the test transactions you're going to perform should not be more than maybe 2 naira, 3 naira, 1 naira 50 kobo, 50 kobo is just to see that the transactions can go through. So you see that there's no need for a developer, that's an admin now, having like 1 million naira in his wallet. So the monitoring of these privileged users was what helped the auditor to discover this fraud, right? So that's just an example there to drive home the point. Okay, another Cisa style question. Which of the following is the primary purpose of maintaining audit logs in an information system? Anybody can answer. The primary purpose of maintaining audit logs in an information system.
It should be to detect and investigate unauthorized activities, because if these logs are not being maintained, we won't be able to track or investigate activities done.
Yes, that is correct. So the primary purpose of audit logs is to provide accountability and traceability by recording system and user activities. This enables detection, of course, investigation and response to unauthorized or suspicious actions. Again, I said something earlier. If you have logs and you're not reviewing it, you see that it's of no use. So the essence of having logs is for you to review those logs, right? So which is why if you look at the heading of this slide, it says access, monitoring, and logging. So you have to also monitor what has been logged and not just having logs for the sake of logging activities, right? So yes, the correct answer is B. Another question. An IS auditor is reviewing an organization's log management process. Which of the following is, in bold letters, most important control to ensure the effectiveness of audit log monitoring? Anyone can answer. Anyone there? Hello?
The correct answer should be C. So there should be reviewing of the log regularly from time to time by somebody who is independent of the system operations. So it's C.
Okay, thank you very much. That is correct. And that's to reduce the risk of concealment. Because if I'm the owner of the system, I'm the system operator, and I'm also the one to review my own log, of course, I can conceal some things or manipulate evidence because I'm the one doing it, right? So the correct answer is C. Thank you very much for that. Right? Now, this is another question, a sister start question. Which of the following risk is best mitigated by implementing a centralized log management and monitoring solution? There's a pro tip here. Now, when you're answering audit log questions, please focus on accountability, traceability, and detection, right? Anyone can answer. Which of the following risk is best mitigated by implementing a centralized log management and monitoring solution?
I think it is the risk of the failure to detect coordinated security incidents across systems.
Okay, that is very correct. But let me also just quickly digress into what a centralized log management system is. So it's basically called a CM, that's a security event and incident management system. So we have examples are things like Splunk. So you could have a firewall, right? You could have a firewall. You could have other, maybe antivirus. You could have other solutions, pockets of solutions. Remember, alerts are being generated from antivirus. Alerts are being generated from the firewall. But the CM is that's SIM, Security Information and Event Management System. Examples are we have IBM QRadar, we have things like Splunk and all of that. So what it does is it aggregates all of those logs from different enterprise devices real time. Then it will now correlate all the events, things like failed logons, firewall drop or malware alerts and things like that, and present to you like a unified or like a summarized coordinated security incidents across your systems, right? So the correct answer is actually C. Okay, remember when we started talking about protection of information assets, I said some of our assets include your network. Your network is also part of your assets, your IT assets. You have things like your data, you have proprietary information like if you have built your own software for use. For instance, the solution on which Sterling Bank runs its business was developed by Sterling Bank, right? So those are part of their assets. And one of the assets we also have is called your network. Now, what are some of the network access controls we have? We have things like your firewall. We have VPN, virtual private network. We have VLAN segmentation, that's virtual LAN. We have your Wi-Fi authentication. Wi-Fi stands for wireless fidelity. And of course, we have zero trust, right? I'll explain most of these things in detail. Now, firewalls could be categorized by form or placement. We have by form and placement, we have things like the hardware firewall, which is like a physical appliance that is placed your network perimeter. An example would be like Palo Alto firewall. They have the next generation firewall. We have something like software firewall, which is host-based. Host-based means that it is installed on individual devices like your server, your laptop, and it is for specific device-specific protection. So if, for instance, you have your application server, for instance, your application server, you can install a host-based firewall on that particular server. And the essence is to block unwanted traffic from hitting that server. We also have cloud firewall, which is like a cloud hosted service that secures your cloud assets. Now, remember that we now have various forms of cloud services. We have firewall, this like basically firewall as a service, right? This is basically firewall as a service. We also have infrastructure as a service where a company can provide you with systems in the cloud. All you're doing is to just provision your access to their systems in the cloud. The benefit of that is you don't have to go to the market to start buying servers, buying monitor, buying AC to cool your servers, doing a whole lot of things around those your infrastructure. You're basically, what you have done is to basically move your infrastructure from on-premise to the cloud. So for on-premise, you're basically responsible for everything in the server room, from your servers to making sure that there is forced cooling, that's AC. Of course, once there's AC, you have to make sure that there's 24 hours power, but you also need to make sure that there's backup. You also need to make sure that there are fire prevention and maybe fire or water sprinklers in place, fire extinguishers. You have to put a staff there to administer the servers. So it involves a whole lot of costs just running your server in your premises. So excuse me, a whole lot of organizations are moving their services to the cloud, right? Now, the third type of firewall by form and placement is network firewall. This one basically protects the entire network and it's basically placed on a perimeter. Of course, we have internal firewall as well, which is placed within a network to secure that segment. That's basically protecting internal zones in your network. Then if you want to classify firewalls by filtering method and generation, you have what is called the packet filtering firewall. Now, this firewall basically checks individual packets. When you are trying to browse, like your office right now, and you're trying to connect to a particular server, for instance, your Yahoo, for instance, that firewall will check the individual packets, such as the source and destination IP, the port numbers for basic rules, and this is a stateless firewall. And then next we have the stateful inspection firewall. This one tracks all active connections and contexts, and it offers greater security than the first one, which is like the packet filter. We have the proxy firewall, which is basically like an application level gateway. It acts as an intermediary first between the application and your own browser. And this is basically for deep content filtering, so depending on what you're trying to access. And then, of course, I said earlier, we have the next generation firewall. This one now, has two added components. It has the intrusion prevention and intrusion detection. And most of them now include deep packet inspection. So intrusion prevention is when someone is trying to gain unauthorized access into your network, this next generation firewall will prevent that attacker from gaining access, while the intrusion detection will simply alert you that somebody has gained unauthorized access to your network, and then you can now go ahead and act on it. Finally, we have the web application firewall. This one basically speaks to a firewall that basically protects web application. So if you have a customer-facing application, such as let's say a bank application that is customer-facing, the web application firewall is also installed to protect, from attacks like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and all of that. Then VPN. So look at VPN this way. VPN is like a tunnel. Normally, when you connect to your ISP is your internet service provider. All of your activities can be seen by your internet service provider, which is how they're able to catch most of these so-called Yahoo boys, right? Because if you are connected to maybe MTN's network or any of these private, maybe fiber nets, fiber one, and all of that, the provider can actually see the sites you are visiting, which is where VPN comes in. Now, VPN is, basically stands for virtual private network, and it establishes a secure connection by creating a tunnel between that public infrastructure, which is your ISP, so that whatever site you are visiting, nobody can see it. So it basically enhances privacy and and helps you manage data access, right? So imagine that it's almost like you're in a glass office, right? Your boss can see what you're doing in your office because from his own office, he can see your office. That's what the current arrangement is right now. But with a VPN, it's like you've obscured the glass. Your boss from his office cannot see what you're doing in your own office. That's just what the VPN does. It helps encrypt your traffic. They can see that something is passing through the network, but they cannot know what it is. And that is just basically what the VPN does. Now we have VLAN segmentation. Now, so what this VLAN segmentation means is you're simply taking a single physical network let's say you have you've taken a connection from MTN, and that is a physical network infrastructure. Then you're now splitting it into multiple isolated logical networks. These are like broadcast domains, right? And you can split it into, various ways. You can do it by traffic containment. You can have broadcast domain isolation. These are basically all the ways you can split your VLAN. And the essence is, I'll give an example. I don't know if you've been in a particular office environment where you will see you're connected to a particular network. You will see finance and admin. If you go to your colleague's office, maybe it's in the next building or on the next floor, you will see him connected to, let's say, commercial, right? If you go to the next desk, you see another person connected to IT. That is called that's VLAN segmentation. And the essence is, if there's an issue within, let's say, finance and admin, it will not affect any other network. Let's say somebody in finance and admin's, or let's say finance and admin network has been hacked. It will not affect IT, it will not affect commercial. It's a way of isolating. It's for granular traffic management, so that if there's a problem, it doesn't spread to the entire organization, right? And this VLAN basically operates as layer 2 to ensure that frames only travel to unauthorized, to authorized switch ports within the same network segment. So if there's an issue, sometimes I've been in a particular office where you will hear somebody say, my network, I don't have network, but your colleague who's in the next table has network. And that's because you're connected to different segments within that one physical network. So if there's an issue on my own network, it will not affect another person, right? Now, Wi-Fi authentication. Again, like I said, Wi-Fi stands for wireless fidelity. And Wi-Fi authentication is a fundamental network control, which helps to verify identity of authorized users before they are granted access to network resources. Yeah. So in secure environments, there are companies where they allow what we call BYOD, that bring your own device. But of course, before you can access the network through the wireless connection, IT would have made sure that your device is secure. They've installed antivirus. They've installed several. They put several, mitigants in place to ensure that company data under your system is not compromised. Yeah? So this is what this slide basically speaks to. The risk that we're trying to prevent here includes eavesdropping, man-in-the-middle attack, and of course, unauthorized bandwidth consumption. There are some times when somebody is connected to a particular company Wi-Fi without controls. That person can also share that Wi-Fi connection on the laptop with another device, right? So without controls, that can happen, and then of course, that can introduce unauthorized access and all of that. Now, zero trust. This is where we are right now, and it's a modern security framework, which is never trusts, always verify principle. Now, this one basically removes any implicit trust for users and devices by requiring strict authentication every time. Every time you're trying to access system resources, it will ask for authorization, regardless of whether you're within the company's network or whether you're outside. Every time you're trying to connect, it will ask you for authorization. You have to put in your username and password. This is for environments that are very big on security, like InterSwitch. They implemented zero trust access, right? Now, these are some Cisa style questions. And the first one says, which of the following control is most effective in preventing unauthorized access between internal network segments? I think I spoke to this earlier. Anyone can answer? Hello? Anyone can answer, please? Anyone?
I would say network segmentation using firewalls or VLANs.
Hello, can anyone hear me?
We can hear you now.
Yes, can hear you.
Oh, I lost you for a bit there. So I basically asked, okay. I basically asked a question and I was hoping for.
I said network segmentation using VLANs.
Okay. Yes, that's correct. Network segmentation basically helps to limit lateral movements by controlling traffic network zones. So yes, that's correct. Thank you very much. This is another question. What is the primary security benefit of implementing VLAN within an internal network?
So I can't see your screen. I don't know if your screen is up.
Yeah, okay, it's up. Can you see it now? Can anyone see my screen?
No.
Yes, it's visible.
Let me try and log
Okay.
out and log in again.
I think the primary aim of doing VLAN is to separate the option is not displaying the page again.
Yes.
Is to separate. I think you mentioned it the other time when we talk about a granulated network something. So yes, to separate network traffic so that when we are talking about IT, finance and admin having access or something. So the primary
Yes.
security benefit is to separate network traffic.
Yes, and it is a logical separation of network traffic. So if there's an issue, maybe within the finance and admin's network, or if it has been hacked, for instance, the person cannot move from finance admin's network segment to another segment, right? It is basically contained. So yes, that's very correct. Yes, thank you. And one final question. Which of the following best reflects the core principle of a zero trust security model? Anyone can answer?
The answer should be C, to verify identity and device structure continuously, because you said earlier that it's never trust. So for every attempt to access the system, you have to put in your login details for every attempt. So the system is not trusting anything, no matter where you are, whether in the office or out of the office.
Yes, that shows you've been really listening. Yes, that is very correct. So zero trust assumes no implicit trust and requires continuous verification of users, device regardless of network location. So yes, that's very correct. So at this junction, I wanted to find out if we have any question based on what we have so far. Anyone can start. Hello, waiting for questions, please.
Okay, I just want to have one short quick question. The other time we were talking about MFA and two-factor authentication. I just want to ask that, does it mean that MFA cannot go beyond 3 levels that we talked about the other time? Or if it is MFA, it can be 4 or 5. Or does it mean that it cannot be more than 3?
Okay, thank you very much. So MFA, okay, so MFA has 3 main categories of factors, right? And I said two-factor is a subset of MFA. So all two-factor, all MFA are, how do I put it? So MFA relies on 3 main factors, and this speaks to something you know. It doesn't go beyond these 3. It's either something you know, which could be a PIN, a password, or a security question. It could also be something you have, like your token. And I'll give an example, and it depends on the user, right? For organizations that are big on security, and depending on the staff that is involved, I give an example of my account. So for my own account, it requires MFA, right? It requires all 3. So first of all, I have to put in my password, and then it will ask me for my token. The token could be a physical token, like I said, or it could be soft token that you can get through an app. These days we have, Google has its own, it's called the Authenticator. Microsoft has theirs as well, So you could actually get either the hard token or the soft token, or it could also be your smartphone. And then the third factor is something that you are. So the example I was giving you, if I'm trying to access my account, I have to put in my password. Then it will ask me for my token. I put in my token, and then I also need to enter my fingerprint. So those are the 3 factors. Is that something? So, but for two-factor, it only asks you for either something you know or something you have, but not all 3. Or it could ask you for something you know or something that you are. So you could either put your PIN or password and your fingerprints. So that is two-factor authentication. But for multi-factor authentication, it has to be all 3 factors. It doesn't go beyond these 3. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
So do we have any other question? Because basically that covers the logical access controls segment of protection of information assets. Again, protection of information assets is, has one of the highest weight. It's about 26, right? About 26. And when you combine that with domain 4, which also has a weight of 26, that is 52 already, which is over half the entire weight of the Cisa domains. Domain 1 has 18%. Domain 2, which is governance and management of IT, has 18 as well. Domain 3, which is system development lifecycle, has 12%. So this other two I talked about has 52 combined, which is where I think we need to put in more work. Again, this should not be the only resource use. There are several resources. If you have the CISA manual, review manual, that is also a very good resource. Online, you could also get resources to help you better understand this particular domain. Again, what we have gone through is not the entirety of protection of information assets. We simply looked at a part of it, and logical access control is part of the ITGC, that's IT general controls, which speaks to some of your entity level controls when you are going by the COSOR way or the internal control of financial reporting, right? So that's basically the content for today's presentation. So if you have questions, this is a very good time to ask, and I'll do my best. I'm waiting for your questions, please. I've not heard from Gunnar, I've not heard from Ibrahim. So I'm waiting for you guys to bombard me with questions.
No question from me.
Okay. So Rachel, are you on this call?
Yes, I'm here. Okay, so thank you so much, Mr. Omaka, for this very, very interesting session. I enjoyed myself. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining. If you're not in any of our WhatsApp group, I'll be dropping the number for you to reach out to. So you can send a message for you to be added to the Cisa waitlist group. So I think that will be all for today. Thank you so much for joining. See you all tomorrow by 12 noon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
Have a
you
great day.
very much. We appreciate
Thank
Thank
you
you
very
very much.
much.
Have a good day.
We appreciate.